Have you ever wondered what you'd do if a creature straight out of legend left its dying child on your doorstep during a blizzard? In the frozen wilderness of the Ouachita Mountains, a reclusive former firefighter, his loyal dog, and a mother Bigfoot cross paths in a story of unexpected redemption. The truth few know is this: Bigfoot is not a predator, but a being capable of trust, of grief, of love. In a hidden ravine, a fading creature offers one last chance for a broken man to rescue not just a life, but his own soul. Everett Miles, haunted by the fire that took his team, thought he'd never wear the rescuer's mantle again. But this time, no one's watching, and no one's asking. If you've ever carried the weight of guilt, this film will show you that compassion can heal what time cannot. Sometimes, a single act of kindness can forgive a lifetime of mistakes. Inspired by Ozark folklore, Under the Willow Shade tells the story of one man who risked everything to save a dying Bigfoot child and found a forgotten kind of peace among the trees. If you've ever missed your chance to say, "I'm sorry," don't miss this film. Under the Willow Shade, where human memory and forest memory meet, once and forever. It was the kind of cold that cracked the trees from the inside. Wind howled down from Black Fork Mountain like a voice too old to form words, rattling the frosted glass of the cabin windows and slipping through the warped wood of the eaves. Inside, the only sound was the slow tick of the kerosene lantern swinging on a bent nail, and the occasional dry pop of the wood stove as sap exploded deep inside a log. Everything else, the world, the past, the future, was snowbound. Everett Miles lay in the dark, awake long before the wind had started to scream. His cot creaked as he shifted, joints stiff from cold and years. The dog hadn't stirred. Usually Scout would have been at his side by now, paws clicking across the plank floor, tail thumping. But the space beside the stove was empty. Everett sat up, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and listened. No panting, no claws, no dog. Just the rattle of wind and something else. It started as a vibration in his chest. Not loud, not sharp, just low, deep, felt more than heard. A sound with weight, not thunder, not a bear growl, not wind. It didn't repeat. It just was, for a long, slow second. Then nothing. He was already pulling on his coat. The old hinges groaned as he swung open the cabin door. A rush of white air hit him in the face, curling down his neck like water poured from a grave. His breath crystallized instantly. And there on the porch, Scout, sprawled motionless, half-curled near the step, steam rising faintly from his side. Everett dropped to his knees. The dog's fur was slick with melted snow, but not blood. Alive, still breathing. Around Scout's neck, tied loosely but with strange care, was a braided strip of willow bark, pale against the thick fur, woven tight, almost ceremonial. Everett touched it like it might burn him. It didn't. Then he saw it. At the edge of the tree line, beyond the porch, beyond the dead truck and the old water barrel, a figure stood, tall as the doorway, broader than a man should be, upright, still. The snow swirled hard around it, but it didn't move. Just one beat, one long breath, and then it stepped backward into the dark. Not ran, not fled, just gone. Everett stayed frozen there beside his dog for a while, long enough for the rattle in his hands to quiet, for the sting in his chest to level out. He wasn't young anymore. He hadn't been scared like that since Pigeon Creek. Scout stirred and whimpered. Everett lifted him gently. The old dog was heavy, dead weight in his arms, but Everett had carried bodies heavier, had pulled men out of trees, had tried to resuscitate ashes. Back inside, the lantern threw amber shadows on the wall. The photo still hung there. Pigeon Creek 79. 11 men in yellow. Laughing, squinting, a mountain behind them. A mistake waiting to happen. He set Scout down on a folded wool blanket and sat beside him, one hand resting gently on the dog's ribs. The breath was there, shallow but steady. The sound came back to him again, not the rumble from the ridge, the other sound, the one he hadn't heard but could never forget. That night in '79, when the wind had changed direction, and so had the fire, when his order to push forward cost them 3 men. The radios had melted, the trees had screamed, and afterward, the silence was the worst of all. Tonight's silence wasn't empty. It was watching him. He rose slowly, moved to the door again. This time he didn't step outside. He just looked. There, on the porch step, where Scout must have been dropped, a shape. The imprint of a hand, 5 fingers, massive, longer than any man's. The grooves of skin ridged into the grain of the old plank. The snow had melted where it touched and refroze into a thin, glassy layer. A trace. Everett stared at it, his breath fogging the window. Not just a mark, a message. It hadn't harmed Scout. It had brought him back. He closed the door quietly, bolted it, checked the stove, fed another log into the belly of the fire. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows that reached for the corners of the room and pulled back. Scout made a sound like a sigh. Everett bent to check him again. Still warm, still with him. He ran a hand gently along the dog's ribs and felt the rise and fall, slower now. Peaceful, almost. The bark braid still lay loose around Scout's neck, and Everett gently pulled it off. It was intricately wound. No tool could have done it. This was handwork, patient work. He thought of the stories Ruth Ann used to murmur behind the counter at Weaver's store. About lights in the hills, shapes too big to be deer, too quiet to be bear. He'd laughed at her. He always laughed. But tonight, his breath caught in his throat. Because something had come out of the woods during a storm, had carried his dog, not killed it, and left it safely on his porch, tied a sign around its neck. He turned the willow strip over in his hands again and again until the lamp dimmed. In the dark, he didn't dream. At first light, the storm had stopped. The trees glistened like bones under crystal skin. The snow was piled high but clean, untouched. Everett opened the door again with caution, half expecting something to be standing there. Nothing was, but Scout was awake, weak, but alert. When Everett knelt beside him, the dog's ears lifted slightly, and then his nose twitched. He turned his head and stared, not at Everett, but toward the edge of the forest. Everett followed the line of his gaze, past the tracks already filling with fresh snow, past the split-log fence, into the woods. Scout tried to stand. Easy, boy. But the dog pressed his nose forward again, stubborn, eyes fixed. Everett stood, rubbed a palm against his jaw. The stubble scratched like frost on denim. He glanced back into the cabin, then at the step, then toward the trees. "All right," he muttered, pulling on his coat again. "Let's see what the hell this is." Scout didn't rise, but his gaze followed Everett like a command passed without words. The air was brittle and bright as he moved through it. His boots crunched with a sound that felt too loud. He passed the old fence, his hands brushing the top rail like it might offer some grounding. Then he saw them. 3 wooden stakes, driven diagonally into the ground, worn, weathered, not fresh, but placed with clear intent, forming a triangle, not random, not natural. Just past them, the wind shifted, the scent of smoke. Not from his cabin, older, pine resin, cold iron, and something else, something wet. He paused, half turning, and looked back toward the cabin. Scout still watched from the porch. Then Everett knelt and placed a tin canteen just inside the triangle. Water, fresh, clean. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small glass bottle of antiseptic. Set that beside the canteen. Slowly, he stepped backward. 1, 2, 3 paces, then turned. Didn't look back. Not yet. He could feel the tree line watching him again. Not like prey, like judgment or curiosity. Inside, Scout let out a low, grateful whimper as Everett crossed the threshold again. The stove was still warm. The lantern needed refilling. The snow outside was already falling again, slower now. But it was the kind of snow that covered stories, not erased them, just buried. And Everett, retired, forgotten, once a man who gave orders that cost lives, stood there in the doorway of that forgotten cabin, clutching a braid of willow bark and listening. Somewhere deep beyond the timberline, a sound returned. Not a roar, not a growl, a resonance. A low, slow, patient hum that rose through the belly of the earth and settled deep in his chest, as if the forest was breathing, and had just decided he was part of it again. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there in the pale morning light of 1991, with a memory tightening in his throat and snow melting in the grooves of a massive handprint on his porch. And for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The storm hadn't truly passed. It had only paused. A silence too thin to trust had settled over the ridge like a drawn breath, but the wind still hung in the trees like something unfinished. The kind of silence where you could still hear the world remembering how to roar. By morning, Everett hadn't slept much. Scout had stirred once or twice, enough to let him know the dog was still there, still tethered to this side of the world. But his energy was drained, and whatever strange journey had brought him back to the porch in the dead of night had left him hollow and trembling. He wouldn't eat, barely lifted his head, but his nose worked. It started subtle. Scout sniffed the air once, then again. Not sharp or urgent, just drawn. And then his eyes locked onto the window, still, focused. He didn't bark, just stared. Everett stood slowly. The floor creaked under his boots, old timber groaning like bone. The cabin was still dark except for the warm oval of light from the stove. He walked to the window and followed the line of Scout's gaze. Nothing moved, but he knew enough to listen. Scout whimpered, low and thin. Then, with surprising will, he rolled onto his side and pushed up with trembling legs. He pointed his nose again. Same direction, south slope, same woods. Everett stepped out onto the porch, breath fogging thick in the cold air. The world was white and sharp-edged. Snow crusted over the railings like icing left too long. The trees creaked in the wind, not talking, just holding their weight. He didn't know why, but he trusted the dog. He pulled on his coat, slipped the canteen into his pack, and left the door ajar just wide enough for Scout to watch him disappear into the tree line. The cold bit his fingers through the gloves, but his feet knew the way. He passed the place where the handprint had frozen into the wood. The ice had melted and refroze twice now, but the shape still lingered like a brand. Past the split fence, past the truck long since rusted to stillness. The world narrowed into a trail no one had made. There was no trail. Just instinct, and Scout's eyes in his mind. He ducked under a fallen limb, stepped over a creek half frozen in mid-flow, and then he saw them. 3 stakes, not from nature. Too deliberate. They were thin pine limbs, stripped and shaved at one end, driven diagonally into the ground like someone had speared them down from above. 3 of them, forming a triangle about waist-high. Not symmetrical, but precise in its own way. A warning, or a welcome. He stopped in front of them, let the silence build. Then, slowly, he took off his glove and unscrewed the cap of his canteen, poured a small measure into a tin bowl from his pack, set it at the center of the triangle, reached into the inner pocket, and pulled out a tiny glass bottle. Antiseptic. Burned like fire when it touched skin. He placed that beside the bowl. Then he did something strange, something no one taught him. He stepped back, 3 full paces, didn't break eye contact with the stakes, just backed away slow, respectful, like approaching a grave you didn't dig. The wind shifted. A crow called once from deeper in the woods, and then all was still again. Everett waited. He didn't know for what. Nothing came forward, nothing changed. But something watched. The trees felt different here. The snow wasn't as deep. It lay in uneven patches, like something heavy had passed through not long ago. Not stomping, not trampling, just moving with quiet purpose. He crouched low, listening. From the corner of his eye, the dark split in the stone appeared. A cleft in the rock face, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways if he wanted to get stuck and die there. But he didn't approach. He just watched. Inside that shadow, barely visible in the gloom, something moved. Not fast, not afraid. Thin limbs, matted hair, a trembling that didn't come from cold alone. It was smaller than the shape he'd seen last night. Much smaller, maybe 5 feet tall, hunched low, one arm cradling the other like it hurt. Its fur was tangled with dried leaves, patches missing. It was breathing, but not steady, almost gasping. And then, behind it, a presence filled the air. Not a movement, not a footstep, just pressure, like the trees had leaned closer. Eyes, amber, reflective, still. Willow shade. That was the name Everett gave it. Had to call it something. Couldn't keep thinking of it as just that. It stood behind the smaller one, towering, calm, watching him as much as it was guarding the cleft. Its chest rose and fell slow, steady. It didn't blink. He didn't move. The air between them was thin, but full of meaning. Everett felt the weight of it. Not fear, not exactly, but the kind of awe that strips you down to whatever's left after survival. The kind of silence that filled the lungs like prayer. He didn't reach forward, didn't step closer. He just knelt, slowly, and placed a small square of gauze down near the stakes. A gesture. Then, from the ridge above, the sharp metallic chink of steel on steel. His heart seized. He knew that sound. Old traps made that noise when the wind shook the trees. But this was no wind. This was recent, close, deliberate. Doyle Murrell. The bastard was back in the woods. Everett turned just enough to scan the ridge, but saw nothing. Only the brittle shine of ice on branches, the sagging weight of snowfall hanging off the pines. But the sound hadn't lied. Willowshade hadn't moved, but its eyes flicked once, up toward the ridge, then back to Everett, understanding. There was someone else here, and he wasn't here to offer medicine. Everett rose slow, muscles tight. He nodded once, not sure why. Just something old in him that remembered how to say, "I see you. I'll come back." He turned, stepped back through the triangle of stakes, and didn't look over his shoulder again until he hit the slope. The cold bit deeper now. The light had shifted too. Sun no longer flat gold, but bleeding into a gray that meant snow would return before dusk. He reached the edge of the tree line and paused. The dog was standing now. Scout was on all fours, shaky but alert, waiting at the edge of the porch like he knew everything that had passed in the woods. Everett knelt when he reached him, hand on the dog's back. The braid of willow bark still lay beside the step where he'd left it. He picked it up, turned it in his fingers again. Still damp, still cold. Scout leaned into him. Everett closed his eyes for a moment, long enough to feel the pulse of the forest still under his skin. There was a wounded creature in that crevice, and a bigger one standing guard. And now, something else. A man who didn't belong. This wasn't just between him and the forest anymore. The boundary had been marked, and someone had stepped across it. The wind didn't let up that morning. It just curled in closer, colder, like it wanted to hear everything he was thinking. Everett sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. Scout curled beside him under a wool blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and old cedar. The kettle on the stove hissed but didn't boil. He hadn't noticed. His hands were busy with cloth and thread. Bottles of antiseptic lined beside a cracked ceramic bowl of warm water. His mind wasn't here. It was somewhere else. Back in the middle of fire. He remembered the scream before the flames. That awful, sharp inhale of silence right before it all collapsed. Pigeon Creek, a name that hadn't passed his lips in years. A place he never thought he'd revisit. Not in memory, not in guilt. and certainly not in muscle memory. But as he pressed the soaked cloth against the wound on the creature's leg, the younger one they'd seen in the crevice, his hands moved exactly like they had that night. He started with heat, just enough to raise the body temp gently, not all at once. Too fast and the shock would set in. You learn that the hard way. Scout whined softly as Everett dipped the cloth again and cleaned the tiny patch of frostbitten skin behind the creature's knee. The matted hair was thick and coarse, dark, nearly black, but threaded with bits of pine bark, moss, and dried blood. This wasn't from a single wound. It was where. This young one had been crawling, hiding, starving. He wrapped the first bandage without thinking, tied it loose enough for swelling, snug enough to keep the salve in place. He didn't look up yet. Didn't dare. Willow Shade was out there, not far, watching from the tree line like the whole forest was holding its breath. Another breath, this one deeper, lower, not human, not threatening. It rolled through the walls of the cabin like thunder that had no interest in lightning. Not a growl, not a warning, just presence. Willow Shade was close. Everett didn't answer with words. He didn't have any that fit. Instead, he reached up slowly, palm to chest, and then lowered his hand to the floorboards. A gesture he hadn't used in decades. The kind they taught in fire school when a man died and you had nothing else to offer. Hand to heart, heart to ground. He'd forgotten how much that meant until now. The creature didn't respond, but the breathing steadied. Scout nudged the bowl of water gently toward Everett. A quiet kind of help. The dog hadn't barked once, only watched, observed. Like he understood that every sound now had weight, that this cabin was no longer just theirs. Outside, the light shifted. Not quite dusk, not quite day. The kind of gray that hovered in the middle and made everything feel like a dream barely holding together. Everett wiped his hands and sat back, watching the small form sleep. So fragile, so familiar. He'd seen this before, not in body, but in spirit. That raw edge of survival clinging to something soft and not quite gone. A boy in a collapsed house in Pine Bluff. A woman under a felled tree in Jasper. One of his own crew, back when they still called him Cap. He didn't remember all their names. But the faces were ghosts that never stopped visiting. He thought of Wallace, the kid with the nervous hands who used to draw flames on his helmet. And Trent, who'd always said if he died in the line, he wanted to be burned with his boots on, not zipped up like some forgotten thing. They weren't burned, they were incinerated, and Everett was the one who gave the order. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, and poured another cup of water. His reflection in the kettle was warped and tired. A man fraying at the edges. He didn't speak aloud, but he thought it hard enough that it echoed, "I'm trying to do right by something, anything, just once." From outside, the breath came again, lower this time, steady, like acknowledgement. Everett stepped to the doorway and opened it just enough to see. There, not more than 20 feet off, just behind the sugar maple that leaned too far from the wind, Willow Shade stood, shoulders hunched like a bear, arms long and heavy. The eyes weren't glowing. They were just open. Amber catching daylight, reflecting things a man didn't have words for. No one moved. He didn't have to. The quiet said more than sound could ever manage. Then something else stirred. Everett's ear caught it before his eye did. A flicker near the ridge. A glint. Just a flash. He stepped out, boots crunching in the snow, and stared toward the slope beyond the first tree line. His stomach clenched. He knew what it was. A cigarette, lit and dropped. The ember glowed red for a second before disappearing into the frost. Doyle, the bastard, was close. Watching. Like a rat circling a barn fire, not brave enough to strike, not dumb enough to walk away. Everett could almost hear the drag of the match, the smirk behind the smoke. He turned back toward the porch. The small one hadn't moved, still sleeping, still breathing. Willow Shade hadn't stepped closer, but Everett could tell. The tension had shifted. The forest didn't hum now. It pulsed. The balance had been upset. Everett knelt at the edge of the porch and looked toward the ridge again. He didn't see Doyle, but he didn't have to. The man was out there, probably behind that old hunting blind, waiting for a shot, or a picture, or a reason. He pulled the blanket tighter around the young one's shoulders, then stood and walked back to the edge of the woods, just inside the triangle stakes. He didn't step beyond them, just stood there, hands by his side. A long moment passed. Then Willow Shade let out a sound unlike the others. Not a breath, not a growl. It had tone, low, drawn, almost spoken. It didn't sound like language, but it didn't sound like nothing. It meant something. Everett nodded once, slow. There were no weapons between them, only understanding. Scout shifted again, this time crawling closer to the bandaged creature and curling beside it like a shield. Everett stared at the two of them, then at the woods, then at the invisible thread that connected them all in a way no one back in town would believe. Hell, he wasn't sure he believed it either. He stepped back inside, closed the door gently, lit the lantern again. The picture on the wall caught his eye. The one from Pigeon Creek. 9 men smiling, 2 not. One face slightly blurred from water damage, but he knew who it was. Trent. He walked up to the photo and touched the glass with the back of his fingers. "I didn't know how to save you," he whispered. And now maybe, just maybe, he'd been given a second chance to save something. From the slope above, somewhere in the trees, a branch snapped. Not from weight, from tension. This wasn't over. And the fire from Pigeon Creek had come back in a different form. In town, the snow didn't settle the way it did up on the ridge. It turned gray fast, melted into slush on the main road and froze again in the shadows between the gas station and Ruth Ann Weaver's store. It looked clean from a distance, but anyone who lived here knew better. That town had rot in its bones, just like the woods, just better at hiding it. Ruth Ann stood behind the counter with her elbows resting on a faded Arkansas State Fair towel, and her eyes set on Everett like she knew more than she should. Her hair was tied up with an old church ribbon, but the lipstick was fresh. She'd already restocked the aspirin twice that morning. Said it was the cold. Said folks were coming down with headaches from the shifting pressure. But Everett knew she was watching the side roads, watching the ones who came through without names. She didn't ask much, not at first. Just rang up his canned beans, rubbing alcohol and paraffin like they were normal choices for a man still off-grid after all these years. But she paused a moment longer than usual before sliding the brown paper bag toward him. "There's been things," she said. "Noise. Out behind the old logging road. Coyotes, maybe, but too quiet. Tracks folks can't name. Strips of hide nailed up to trees." Everett didn't answer. She waited. He took the bag in one hand and slipped his wallet back into his coat with the other. "I ain't asking for stories," she added, voice lowering. "But if someone's out there hurting things, you'd know first." His boot heel thudded once on the floor as he turned. The bell over the door rang sharp. She didn't stop him, just whispered toward his back. "People sell worse than pelts these days." The road back up was coated in that slick film that came after sunlight touched dirty ice. Everett kept his truck in second gear the whole way, the engine groaning like it didn't want to climb. When he finally reached the cabin, the sky was already pulling dim, and the clouds carried the color of bruises. Scout met him halfway down the steps. The dog had a different energy now. Still slow, still stiff, but eyes sharper. He sniffed the bag and turned his head toward the woods. Everett followed the look. Lawn cans were missing from the fence line. Not blown by wind, not scattered, pulled. The string was cut. He crouched where the line had been, touched the stump of frayed nylon, then looked to the edge of the trees. Barely there. A print, boot tread. Not his. Too wide for Ruth Ann, too fresh for anyone hunting by daylight. He stood. Scout growled once, low and steady. Not a bark, not alarm, just confirmation. Doyle had been here. Everett didn't say a word. He moved inside, packed gauze and bandages into the second satchel. slipped a fire starter into his coat pocket, and opened the drawer beneath the stove. His hand hesitated over the small tin box before grabbing the flare. Not for defense. Not yet. Just light, if needed. He glanced once toward the photo on the wall. Pigeon Creek, still smudged from moisture years ago. Then he grabbed his old cap from the hook. It still smelled faintly of smoke. By the time he reached the edge of the boundary, the sun was dying. Long light slipped low through the trees, casting shadows that danced but didn't belong to anything moving. The triangle of stakes remained untouched, but further beyond them, past the frozen stream bed and under the black pines, the wind carried a different smell. Smoke, faint, resinous, not campfire, something more controlled, and underneath that, animal, not wild, fearful. He moved through the woods like he used to move through burn zones, measured with his weight forward and ears open. At the top of the ridge, he paused. Below, where the crease of rock broke into a shallow drop, he saw movement. Willow Shade was there, still, waiting. The young one, patched up, bandaged, still weak, was tucked beneath a ledge of stone, its breath rising in thin plumes. Scout sat just outside the gap, watching like a sentinel. But something had shifted in the air, a presence that didn't belong. Then he heard it. Clink, clatter, a low rattle of metal brushing against bark. To his right, lawn cans again. Doyle was playing games, noise to scatter, to unsettle, to lure. Everett moved fast, angling behind a cluster of firs. He saw the trip line just as his foot nearly caught it. Crude wire pulled across two stumps, meant to scare or snare, not built to kill. Yet, he cut it clean and kept moving. The ground dropped suddenly. A ravine, narrow, littered with old branches, and at the base, half covered in snow and mud. A trap, open-jawed, old steel, blood on the teeth, not fresh. Beside it, a smear of dark hair, coarse, thick. Willow shades. He turned and looked back up the ridge. Doyle was hunting them. Not for food, for sale, and Everett knew it. He climbed slowly back toward the line of stakes. The younger creature had stirred now, its breath faster, head lifting slightly. It tried to rise but stumbled. Scout moved close, nudging it gently. From the far end of the clearing, Everett saw a flicker of light. Not fire, a camera. Shutter, flash, then gone. Doyle was documenting, getting proof, trying to make something out of shadow. Everett's breath came harder now. His palms itched. He stepped forward into the clearing, arms out slightly, not threatening, just present. Willowshade turned to face him. There was no surprise, only expectation. The big creature took one step toward the bandaged young one, its massive frame cutting a silhouette across the snow like a monument carved from living bark. Then it looked past Everett, into the woods, toward where Doyle had vanished. The silence between them was thick, shared. It wasn't Everett's place to speak, but he did what he could. He knelt beside the young one, checked the bandage. Still clean. The creature made a faint sound, not distress, not gratitude. Something else, something in between. Everett sat beside it, not speaking. Scout lay across the front paws of the young one, as if they were siblings born from different worlds. From the ridge above, the wind carried the sound of a match strike, dry, deliberate, and the low hiss of a cigarette lit behind cover. Doyle hadn't left. He'd just begun. By dawn, the frost had deepened, curling like ash across the old cedar fence, clinging to the porch rails in feathery veins. Scout didn't bark. He just stood by the door with his ears perked and his breath shallow, waiting. Everett hadn't slept. He'd sat near the stove most of the night, elbows on his knees, staring into the slow flame like it might answer something. But the question wasn't in fire. It was somewhere out there, somewhere beneath the stillness. The kind of quiet that warned you something was preparing to move. He laced his boots, slow. Every tug of the leather thudded in the floorboards like a heartbeat too loud in a room too small. The cabin felt tighter than usual. He rose and opened the back hatch. Found what he was looking for buried under a rusted can of lantern oil and a torn tarp from last fall. A thin strip of steel plate, maybe 8 inches long, smooth but etched with the serial number from his old helmet. The only thing that survived Pigeon Creek intact. He turned it over once in his hand, ran his thumb across the numbers, then slipped it into his coat pocket. When he stepped outside, the snow sang beneath his boots, that hollow crunch that told you the top had frozen but the ground hadn't given up just yet. Scout followed without a sound. It was time to draw a line. Everett hiked past the ridge where the first encounter had been, past the wedge of rock sheltering the younger Bigfoot, still recovering but stronger now. The triangular stakes remained as they had, but further along, where the trees began to bend with the slope and the sky narrowed into gray branches, he stopped. He knelt and began collecting the narrowest limbs he could find. Young birch, still flexible, still green. He stripped their ends with his knife, curved them gently into a loose arc, then bent them to form a doorway of sorts. It didn't look like much, but it wasn't for looks. It was a gesture. He planted it just outside the edge of the ravine, careful to face it toward the woods, not away. Then, without speaking, he took the metal tag from his pocket, looped a piece of his old bootlace through the top, and tied it to the center of the arch. It spun faintly in the morning wind, catching the light for a second like a shard of mirror. He stepped back and breathed through his nose. Not prayer, not habit, just presence. A few minutes passed. Then a shape moved at the edge of the tree line. The larger one. Willow shade. Watching again. Breathing slow, as if counting Everett's steps. The sound that came wasn't a voice, but not a grunt either. Something low, something deep enough to stir dust from stone. Everett didn't answer with sound. He reached into the satchel and pulled out a small coil of paracord, tied it gently between the base of the arch and the second stake in the triangle, then sat cross-legged beside it like a guard who wasn't there to block, just to show he'd remain. It took nearly an hour before anything changed. A soft snap of movement, a branch shifting too slow to be wind, and then, barely visible against the bark, a different sound, a long scrape. He turned toward the ridge. Smoke. Not rising, not climbing, creeping. A thin, dirty gray line slithering just beneath the shelf of rock that hugged the east side of the clearing. Someone was trying to drive them out. Not with force, with fear. Everett grabbed his canteen and poured what little water he had left over the base of the arch. He scooped mud in his bare hands, patted it around the edges, trying to hold the smoke line back. It wasn't much, but it'd slow the crawl. He looked back toward the younger one, eyes wide, nostrils flared. Breathing heavier now, Scout barked once, the only warning he gave. Everett spun, squinting toward the haze. No movement, but he knew who it was. Doyle didn't have to show himself to be present. That man knew how to haunt better than most ghosts. His tricks weren't smart, just mean. A slow burn through a stump soaked in oil, hidden behind a ridge too shallow to trap the wind. Everett dragged his coat sleeve across his mouth, tasted ash. He grabbed a handful of wet leaves and pressed them into the smoke path, watched as it curled and hissed, climbing slower now. Not gone, but thwarted. Behind him a sound, different this time. Willowshade stepped forward, not much, just one deliberate stride. The big one didn't speak, but the breath that followed rumbled different. A lower pitch, sharper. Everett turned just enough to listen. Then he froze. There, woven into the lower curve of the arch, where the metal tag had been. Something new. A ribbon. Not fabric, not man-made. A strip of braided willow bark. Damp, tight, precise. He didn't touch it. Didn't have to. It was answer enough. They'd accepted, or at least acknowledged. This was the start of something more than watching. He rose slowly, muscles tight from kneeling, and stepped back from the arch. The snow crunched behind him. Scout had moved closer to the younger one, now standing on its own feet. Not quite steady, but upright. The creature leaned forward, tilted its head toward the metal tag, then turned to look at Everett. A moment passed, one he wouldn't find words for later. Then, without sound, it stepped under the arch and breathed out. The exhale was soft, but it carried steam into the air like incense, like warmth from something deeper. Everett felt the ground beneath him shift. Not the earth, the moment. But then, from behind the ridge, the smoke line pulsed. Too fast now, too high. He knew what Doyle had done. Kerosene. Everett bolted forward, grabbed the edge of his coat, and flung it over the base of the arch. He stomped into the embers, buried the flare of flame before it could leap higher. Scout barked again, this time urgent. Willowshade let out a sound that shook snow from the branches. Not anger, not alarm. A call, low and rolling, deeper than thunder, and laced with something Everett couldn't name. A message. He looked at the young one, now crouched low beside the arch again, trembling. Not from smoke, from something sensed. Then he heard it, a vibration in the wind. Faint, rhythmic, echoes in the hills. Another breath. Not Willowshade, not this one. Another, somewhere out there in the distance. Something answered. A second, a smaller voice. Another young one. Still alone, still waiting, and Everett knew what it meant. This wasn't done. Smoke was just the first wave. The real search had yet to begin. Snow fell softer that morning, not in sheets, but in slow drifting flurries that landed like ash on the shoulders of trees and the brim of Everett's cap. The wind had shifted. Still cold, but quieter now. As if the forest itself was listening, Scout moved ahead, slow but sure, nose low to the ground, tail stiff. The dog had caught something hours ago, a faint scent, buried under cedar mulch and old frost. But whatever it was, he hadn't let go of it. Everett followed, boots crunching through the crust, hands gloved tight around the leather strap of his satchel. His breath hung in the air behind him like a ghost. They'd been walking for nearly 3 miles east of the cabin, further than Everett liked. But the air had changed since the last time Willowshade made that sound. That long, resonant hum that didn't come from throat or chest, but from the deep belly of the land. It had come from a place of warning, or a plea. He wasn't sure anymore where the line was. The trail led them to a thick grove of oaks, knotted and overgrown, where a cluster of old logging posts still stood like forgotten tombstones. Snow clung to their tops in uneven rings. Scout paused at the base of one, sniffed, then turned sharply north. That's when Everett saw it. Just ahead, tucked beneath a hollowed-out root ball of a fallen white oak, was movement. Low, small. He crouched, one hand rising gently. Scout stopped. The shape shifted again. It wasn't shadow. It had form. Legs pulled in tight. Arms wrapped over its head. Covered in thick tangled hair, dark brown with streaks of pale gray down the back. Smaller than the first young one, but alert. It looked up, eyes locked with his. Amber, wide. No sound, no movement, just trembling. Everett stayed low. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a canteen. Unscrewed it slow, poured a splash into his hand and let the steam rise. Then he set the canteen down, open, on a flat patch of moss near the base of the roots. He stepped back. The creature didn't move. He waited. 2 minutes passed, then 3, and finally, it uncurled just enough to sniff the air. It didn't take the water. Not yet, but it saw it, registered it, understood something. That was enough. Everett turned, whistled once, soft. Scout stepped forward, sniffed the ground, then lay down on his belly, tail wagging slightly. The creature watched the dog. Not afraid, just curious. Everett marked the tree with a slash of charcoal, pulled from his satchel a thin stick wrapped in red twine, one of the guide markers he used in rescue work long ago. He jammed it into the ground at the base of the oak, then began setting up 3 more, in a line leading back the way they came. He was building a corridor, not for control, for safety, the kind of path you laid when you wanted someone to follow and not get hurt. By the time they reached the third marker, the young one had crept out from under the roots. Still slow, still testing the wind, but moving, its left leg favored. Everett noted the limp but didn't approach, just kept walking, glancing back every few paces. Willowshade was waiting. At the clearing near the archway of bent branches, the tall form stood still as ever, snow dusting its shoulders, arms relaxed but firm, not rigid, not soft, like a tree taught to move but choosing not to. The first young one was there too, stronger now, crouched behind a clump of ferns near the stump. As Everett led Scout through the last curve of trail, the second young one paused near the final guide stick. It hesitated, then stepped forward, into view. Willowshade didn't move at first. Then something shifted. The big one dropped low, slow. One massive hand reached out and brushed the ground. Then, with care Everett hadn't expected, it leaned forward and touched its forehead to the smaller creatures. A sound followed. Not breath, not voice. A low exhale through closed lips, like the sound of wind through a canyon. The two young ones moved toward each other, almost cautiously, then pressed foreheads. The snow beneath them swirled gently. Scout sat near Everett's leg, watching, silent. Willowshade stood back up, turned, and looked at Everett. It didn't last long, just a second, but the look said more than a dozen words. Acknowledgement, recognition. The ground under Everett's boots felt softer suddenly, like the world had exhaled too. But the peace didn't hold. A sharp clatter echoed from the trees above. Everett spun. The ridge. Rocks. Loose shale tumbling fast, scraping down a narrow slide. Then, a shutter click. Camera. Old style. Film-fed. Fast but not quiet. Doyle. He was here. Not guessing anymore. Filming. Selling shadows. Everett broke into a sprint, arms pumping. He crested the slope in 10 seconds flat. Scout barking now, angry. The smell of cigarette smoke hung in the air like guilt. But Doyle was gone. No footprints. Just the imprint of a knee and a boot scuff leading down slope to an old trap trail. The camera flash had come from behind a broken pine, its bark peeled from years of lightning damage. Good cover. Sharp angle. Back at the clearing, the young ones huddled close. Willowshade had turned toward the noise, body tensed, but hadn't moved from the archway. Everett dropped to one knee, breathing hard. He looked up at the sky. Gray again, but changing. Whatever came next wouldn't be quiet. The sky cracked without warning. Not lightning, not thunder. Just a dry, bone-deep snap that rolled through the hills like something breaking open from the inside. Scout flinched. The two young ones shrank into each other's shoulders. Willowshade raised its head slowly, like an old cathedral lifting its eyes toward fire. Then came the echo, a rifle shot. No echo from tree bark, no rustle of wings or scattering of deer. Just the long, hollow bounce of sound, finding no resistance. Everett's heart skipped one beat, then clenched hard. He knew that sound. Not military, not hunting. A cheap, high-caliber bolt action, fired more to startle than kill. But the woods reacted. The birds went silent. The trees held their breath, and Doyle stepped out of the ridgeline like he owned the whole damn mountain. Everett turned and planted his boots. He was halfway up the slope when Doyle appeared. Rifle slung across his shoulder, camera strap hanging from his neck, smirk twitching beneath a half-chewed cigarette. That same smug slouch like he was still 20 and untouchable. I see you finally came out to play, Cap. Everett didn't blink. Doyle lowered the rifle just enough to be lazy about it. You should have stayed out of it. Everett glanced behind him. Willowshade hadn't moved, but the ground had changed. The snow seemed quieter somehow, as if waiting. He took a breath. You fired that thing near a wounded animal. You trying to start a stampede or a war? Doyle chuckled. War's already started, Miles. You just too old to see it. He stepped forward and tapped the camera. Got it all right here. Proof. Close-ups, full body, kids too. You know what that's worth to the right people? Everett didn't answer, because he knew. And that silence was louder than anything Doyle could say. Course, Doyle added, if something were to happen to you out here. No one'd find you till spring. Everett's hands didn't shake. He wasn't afraid of death. He just hated losing. Doyle grinned. That fire back in '79, you remember how it smelled? That was the cut. The one he waited to make. Everett didn't flinch. He looked straight through Doyle's grin and saw the canyon. Saw the flame walls. Saw the men he'd sent uphill into wind that changed faster than breath. Saw what was left of them when it didn't work. Doyle stepped forward again, just 1 foot. Wrong move, because the ground under that spot had changed since last fall. The crust of snow broke under Doyle's boot, and suddenly he was falling. Not deep, just enough. The trap snapped fast. Iron jaws clamped shut with a metallic scream, and Doyle's own scream followed right behind it. His leg disappeared in a spray of snow and pain. Everett moved fast. Doyle dropped the gun. He was screaming now, louder than the shot, louder than the wind. Everett reached him in 5 seconds, dropped to his knees, saw the jagged steel biting through Doyle's calf. Blood poured. Not clean, but not fatal. Not yet. Help me. Everett looked at the trap, and then at the man in it. You laid this, he said, voice low. You said it. Doyle coughed a sound somewhere between a sob and a curse. I didn't. You baited it, built the trail. Everett touched the side of the trap, tested the spring. Rusted, but not locked. He could open it, but his hands hovered. He looked at Doyle's face. Sweat now. Tears, too. Red face gone pale. You left those boys in the ridge to burn, didn't you? Doyle rasped. Everett didn't blink. You're the one who gave the order. The breath in Everett's chest froze solid. You're the one who said go. I'm still here, Everett whispered. Because I have to be. Doyle coughed again. Then save me. Everett didn't speak, but he reached into his coat and pulled out a length of rope. It wasn't thick, but it was strong. He wrapped it fast. 1 loop, then another. Not on the side. Bow line. Secure. Then he wedged a branch into the steel and pried. It didn't give easily. Doyle screamed again, but the trap opened. The leg pulled free, boot torn, blood soaking fast. Doyle collapsed into the snow, clutching his thigh. Everett didn't help him stand. He just stared at the steam rising from Doyle's leg, the copper smell of pain mixing with frost and pine. Then he looked back, toward the trees, and saw them. Willow Shade was standing near the arch now, closer than ever before. One of the young ones, he couldn't tell which, was crouched beside Scout, watching, silent, waiting. And then Willow Shade moved, not fast, just forward. It walked up to the edge of the clearing, past the archway, and placed something down in the snow. A loop, braided, willow bark, still fresh. It glowed faintly in the winter light. Not a threat, a sign, a mark of survival. Then Willow Shade turned and looked at Everett, eyes dark, deep, ancient. Then it looked at Doyle, and the air shifted, not with rage, but with judgment. Doyle whimpered. Everett stood and walked toward them. The cold didn't matter. The pain in his knees didn't matter. He reached the loop and picked it up, held it to his chest, pressed it flat. Behind him, Doyle sobbed into his coat sleeve, mouthing curses to the trees. Ahead of him, the world felt different, larger, like maybe the worst thing you ever did didn't have to be the only thing you carried forever. Somewhere above, thunder cracked again, but it didn't sound angry. It sounded like something had just been let go. The melt came quiet. It didn't roar or rush. It whispered. Thin streams slithered down the mossy gulches, under fallen logs, between stones that hadn't seen sunlight since December. The last of the snow surrendered slow, leaving behind patches of brown needles and flattened grass, wet and breathing again. Trees creaked not from wind, but from waking. Everett stood near the clearing, leaning on his walking stick. Just a branch, really, smoothed by hand overnights by the stove. His boots sank lightly into the softening ground. Scout lay at his feet, not sleeping, just resting. Ears turned toward the distant ridge like he could feel something coming before it showed. The forest looked different now. Not empty, not dead, just shifting. Then he saw it. The archways. They weren't there the day before. They hadn't been built by hands like his. They were taller than a man, bent from living limbs. Young branches coaxed downward and pinned into the earth, forming quiet doors. And not just one. A whole line of them. Maybe 6, maybe more. Each curved perfectly. Each framed with moss and snowmelt and something older than either. And on each arch, at the top, tied with careful, deliberate knots, hung braided strips of willow bark. Dozens of them. Some damp, some dried by sun. They fluttered in the soft wind, not like flags, but like breath. Everett stepped closer. He didn't speak, didn't dare, because the air around them didn't feel like space anymore. It felt like memory, like ceremony, like something was being done, and he'd been allowed to see it. Willow shade appeared at the first arch. The 2 young ones followed behind, one slower than the other, their steps almost synchronized. No sound, no fanfare, just quiet movement, dignified, steady. Everett watched as they passed beneath the first arch. Willow shade didn't look at him. Not yet. They moved forward together. One arch, then the next, then the next. And with each crossing, Willow shade let out a low breath. Not a call, not a chant. Just breath, deliberate and round, like the forest needed to feel it too. Everett stepped to the side. Scout rose with him and stood still. At the 5th arch, the younger one, smaller of the 2, paused, turned slightly. Their eyes met, and then the creature raised its hand. Just a little, palm open. A gesture he knew. Everett touched his chest, lowered his hand to the dirt. The young one blinked once, then passed under the final arch. Willow shade stopped, turned, faced Everett. No words, but the pause held weight. A wind passed between them, light, lifting the edges of Everett's coat, carried the faint smell of sap, bark, something earthy and old. Willow shade stepped forward, crossing the space between them in 3 slow strides. It stopped just a few feet away, reached down, and touched Scout's head. Not a pat, a press. Scout didn't move. Then the creature straightened and leaned in close to Everett. Everett held his ground. A shadow passed across his face as Willow shade lowered its massive head and gently touched its forehead to Everett's. The contact lasted 1 second, maybe 2. Then Willow shade stepped back, turned, and walked toward the woods. The young ones followed. One of them turned again, just before the tree line, and placed something down on the step of Everett's porch. A loop. Willow bark. Braided. Left behind. Everett stood alone in the middle of the clearing. But the silence didn't feel empty. It felt sealed. Like a door closing behind a visitor who would return. But only when needed. He walked back slow, Scout trailing beside him. The snow had fully melted along the path. Ground soft. Mud rising in the cracks. When he reached the porch, he bent and picked up the braid. Still damp, still warm. He turned it in his hands, fingers running over the knots, the weave. No one else would have known what it meant. But he did. He stepped inside the cabin. It smelled like ash and pine and the soup he'd left on the stove. He walked over to the far wall, where the photo still hung, Pigeon Creek 79. Time had faded the ink, curled the corners, but the faces remained. Some clear, some stained with memory. Everett reached up and hung the willow braid beside it, on a nail once meant for his badge. The 2 things side by side, the men who never came home, and the ones who had no home to begin with. He stepped back. Scout let out a small sigh and curled near the stove. Outside, the wind shifted, brought the sound of moving water, of sap rising, of roots waking under earth. And somewhere far off, a single deep breath. Everett didn't look, didn't need to. The fire crackled behind him. He sat down slow, exhaled. Not goodbye. The forest didn't say goodbye. It just listened and remembered. Sometimes the most powerful bonds are born in silence. Not in words, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when one soul reaches out and another chooses to stay. There's a kind of grace that lives in the wilderness. It doesn't shout or shine. It hums beneath the bark of old trees. It rises with the breath of animals who remember long before we began forgetting. And in the stillness of winter, where loss hangs heavy and the past echoes louder than the present, that grace becomes visible for those willing to look. This story was never about monsters. It was about mercy, about the fragile threads that connect us across fear, across pain, across the long, bitter distance of grief. It was about second chances, how they never come easy, never arrive the way we expect, and never stay long. But when they do, they ask us one thing: will you do better now that you know? Some wounds never close, and maybe they're not meant to. Maybe the point isn't to forget or even to heal fully. Maybe the point is to carry it carefully, honestly, and to keep walking. To meet the unknown not with conquest, but with open hands. To build rituals not from power, but from kindness. The forest does not keep score. It watches, it waits, it remembers who listens. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, it offers something back. Not proof, not explanation, but something far more rare. A moment of shared trust. A breath given and returned. A circle, closed not with closure, but with understanding. There's a kind of wisdom that can't be taught. It can only be lived. Sometimes it looks like an old path rediscovered. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness in the face of failure. Sometimes it looks like a creature you were taught to fear standing in front of you and choosing not to run. In the end, what matters isn't how big the story was. What matters is that we chose to see each other, to stay, to try again. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something deep, something quiet, you're not alone. And that matters more than you know. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What stayed with you? What part whispered your name? If you haven't yet, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories like this. Stories for those who still believe in listening, who still believe in trying. Until next time, take care of each other and leave the world a little kinder than you found it.